In the year 2076, Earth had finally made first contact with intelligent extraterrestrial life. The encounter wasn't exactly what humanity had envisioned. No grand speeches or galactic diplomacy. Instead, it began with a small, clandestine mission to the distant planet Xaelith, conducted by Earth's exploratory unit, the Celestial Horizon Initiative. The Xaelithians, as they were called, were humanoid but distinctly alien. Taller, with shimmering, almost bioluminescent skin, and eyes that seemed to hold swirling galaxies. Elliot Maxwell, a technician from the Celestial Horizon Initiative, wasn't even supposed to be on the mission. He was a last-minute replacement for a communications officer who'd come down with a particularly nasty strain of flu. Elliot's job back on Earth was simple: repair satellites and fix broken transmitters. He had no experience with interspecies diplomacy, no training in cultural etiquette, and absolutely no clue that he was about to change the course of history. The Xaelithians greeted the Earth delegation with regal poise. Their leader, Queen Seraveth, descended from her crystalline throne, her presence exuding a commanding blend of elegance and power. Elliot had never seen anything like her. Her shimmering violet eyes seemed to pierce straight into his soul, and her voice was a melodic hum that resonated in his chest. The Xaelithians bowed deeply as she spoke, and even the Earth diplomats seemed struck silent by her presence. Elliot, however, was distracted. The translator device in his ear had glitched, garbling the Queen's words into a jumble of nonsense. While the diplomats nodded and smiled politely, Elliot nervously fiddled with his device, trying to reset it. At that exact moment, Queen Seraveth turned her gaze toward him and spoke directly to him in Xaelithian. The garbled translation that filtered through his device sounded like a question, and Elliot panicked. His instincts took over, and he defaulted to what he always did when he didn't understand someone. He nodded and smiled. But Xaelithian culture, as it turned out, had a very specific interpretation of that gesture, one that the translator failed to clarify. Queen Seraveth's expression shifted from serene to astonished, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the Xaelithian court. Elliot froze, realizing he must have done something wrong. Before he could backpedal or ask for clarification, one of the Earth diplomats leaned in and whispered, "What did you just do?" "I don't know," Elliot whispered back, sweat forming on his brow. "I think she asked me something, and I just agreed." The diplomat's face paled. "Elliot," he said slowly, "I think you just proposed to their queen." Elliot's heart nearly stopped. "Proposed? Like marriage?" The diplomat nodded grimly. Queen Seraveth raised her hand, silencing the murmurs in the court. She looked directly at Elliot, her expression unreadable, and spoke again. This time, the translator device worked perfectly. "Do you understand the weight of the commitment you have made, human?" Elliot's mind raced. No. I mean, not really. There's been a mistake." But before he could finish, she stepped closer to him. Her towering presence loomed over him, and the faint glow of her skin seemed to intensify. In Xaelithian culture, a proposal is a sacred bond. To make such an offer without understanding its significance is unthinkable. Her tone softened slightly, though her eyes still bore into him. "But I sense no malice in your actions, only confusion. Speak truthfully. Did you intend to offer your life as my consort?" Elliot gulped. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, but the weight of her gaze pinned him in place. "No. I mean, yes. I didn't mean to offend you, Your Majesty. It was an accident. I swear." The court erupted into whispers once more, but the Queen raised her hand, silencing them again. "An accident," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Fascinating. On Xaelith, accidents are seen as threads of fate. Perhaps your actions are not as unintended as you believe." Elliot stared at her, his mind a swirling mess of panic and disbelief. Was she actually considering this? Before he could respond, a Xaelithian advisor stepped forward. "My queen," he said in a deep, resonant voice, "if the human has made the proposal, it must be honored according to tradition. To reject it outright would bring dishonor to both parties." Elliot's heart sank further. "Wait a second. I didn't even know." The Queen held up her hand, silencing him. "The laws of Xaelith are clear," she said, her voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. But perhaps there is room for interpretation. If this human wishes to rescind his proposal, he must undertake the trials of intent to prove the sincerity of his error. Trials of intent? Elliot echoed, his voice cracking. The advisor turned to him, his expression grave. 3 trials to determine whether your proposal was born of true intention or foolish happenstance. If you succeed, the bond will be nullified. If you fail, he paused, his gaze heavy, you will become the Queen's consort for the rest of your days. Elliot's legs felt like they might give out beneath him. This couldn't be happening. He was just a technician. He fixed broken radios, for crying out loud. And now he was being roped into some alien marriage ritual because of a stupid nod? Do I have a choice? He asked weakly. The Queen's lips curved into a faint smile. There is always a choice, human. But understand this. The path you choose will determine not only your fate but the fate of your people. The eyes of Xaelith, and Earth, are upon you. The room fell silent as Elliot grappled with the weight of her words. He wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this bizarre nightmare. But deep down, he knew there was only one option. He couldn't risk offending the Xaelithians further, not when the fragile relationship between their species hung in the balance. I'll take the trials, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The Queen's smile widened, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. Very well, she said. Let the trials begin. The first trial was a test of courage, designed to measure the strength of his spirit. Elliot was led to a sprawling cavern filled with bioluminescent fungi and shadowy creatures that skittered just out of sight. The task was simple: retrieve a fragment of an iridescent crystal from the heart of the cavern. Simple, of course, in the same way that wrestling a bear was simple. Armed with nothing but a glowing orb to light his way, Elliot ventured into the darkness. Every step was accompanied by the eerie sounds of the cavern, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the rustle of unseen wings, and the occasional bone-chilling growl. He tried to remind himself that he'd survived worse, like the time he'd been stuck in a broken-down satellite for 3 days with nothing but protein bars and recycled air. But this was an entirely different level of terrifying. Halfway through the cavern, he encountered one of the shadowy creatures, a towering, insect-like beast with serrated mandibles and glowing red eyes. Elliot froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature let out a deafening screech and charged toward him. Without thinking, he hurled the glowing orb at it and dove to the side. The orb exploded in a burst of light, stunning the creature long enough for Elliot to grab the crystal and sprint back to the cavern entrance. When he emerged, clutching the crystal and gasping for breath, the Xaelithian court erupted into applause. Queen Seraveth watched him with an inscrutable expression, her violet eyes gleaming. You have passed the first trial, human, she said. But the path ahead will only grow more treacherous. The second trial was one of wisdom, designed to test his ability to navigate complex situations. Elliot was presented with a holographic simulation of an interstellar conflict between 2 rival factions, each vying for control of a resource-rich moon. His task was to broker peace between the factions without escalating the conflict. At first, Elliot floundered, overwhelmed by the intricacies of Xaelithian politics and the constant bickering of the holographic delegates. But as the simulation progressed, he began to notice patterns, hidden alliances, subtle manipulations, and opportunities for compromise. Drawing on his experience as a technician, he approached the problem like he would a broken machine, identifying the faulty components and finding ways to patch them. By the end of the simulation, he'd managed to broker a tenuous but functional peace treaty. The Xaelithian court seemed genuinely impressed, though Elliot suspected they were as surprised as he was by his success. Queen Seraveth nodded approvingly. You are more resourceful than you appear, she said. But resourcefulness alone will not be enough to face the final trial. Elliot's relief was short-lived as he was escorted to the site of the third and final trial, a massive arena carved into the side of a mountain, its stands filled with Xaelithian spectators. The trial, he was told, would test his heart, the core of his intentions. What this actually meant, however, was left deliberately vague. As he stepped into the arena, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. And he was right. Elliot's boots crunched against the crystalline sand of the arena as he scanned his surroundings. The stands buzzed with the hum of anticipation, a sea of glowing Xaelithian eyes fixed on him. At the far end of the arena stood Queen Seraveth, flanked by her advisors. She regarded him with an expression that was equal parts intrigue and expectation, as though she already knew how the trial would unfold. Elliot, however, had no such confidence. The queen raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. Her voice, amplified by some unseen technology, resonated through the arena. The third and final trial will test the sincerity of the human's heart. Let the trial of truth begin. Elliot's stomach churned. The sincerity of my heart? What does that even mean? His question was answered moments later as the ground beneath him trembled. A section of the arena floor slid open, revealing a rising platform. Atop it stood a translucent, swirling mass of light and shadow. It pulsated with an otherworldly rhythm, its shape constantly shifting, one moment resembling a Xaelithian, the next a creature he couldn't even begin to describe. This, the queen explained, is the Veil of Echoes. It is a living embodiment of perception and intent. It will probe your mind, your memories, your fears. If your heart holds true, the veil will grant you passage. If not, she paused, letting the weight of her words settle. It will reveal the truth of your soul to all. Elliot's pulse quickened. He had no idea what the Veil of Echoes would find, or expose. Reveal the truth, he called out nervously, his voice echoing faintly. The queen's lips curved into a small, almost mischievous smile. You will soon understand. The veil pulsed again, and a tendril of light stretched toward him. Elliot instinctively took a step back, but the tendril moved faster, wrapping around his wrist like a warm mist. Suddenly, the world around him dissolved. He was no longer in the arena. Instead, he stood in the cluttered workshop of his late father, surrounded by half-built radios, disassembled drones, and stacks of manuals. The scent of soldered metal and engine grease filled the air, a smell he hadn't encountered since he was a teenager. His father, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a perpetually smudged face, sat hunched over a circuit board. Dad. Elliot's voice trembled. His father looked up, his expression both familiar and disconcertingly neutral. You were never supposed to be here, son. What do you mean? Elliot asked, stepping closer. This is my memory, isn't it? Partly, his father replied, his voice echoing in a way that didn't quite match the setting. But memories are only fragments of the truth. The veil doesn't just show you the past, it reveals what you've buried, what you've avoided. The scene shifted abruptly, and Elliot found himself in the cramped quarters of a space station. He recognized it immediately, the Vagab 7 station, where he'd spent 2 years as a junior technician. He was sitting at a tiny table, staring at a cracked photo frame of his family. He remembered this moment vividly. It was the night he decided to extend his contract, choosing the safety of space over returning home to face the fallout of his failed relationships. You've always run from responsibility, a voice echoed, not his father's this time, but his own. The photo in his hand dissolved into mist, reforming into the image of Queen Seraveth. You're running now, too. Aren't you? Elliot shook his head. No. I'm not running. I'm trying to fix a mistake. This whole proposal thing was an accident. And yet, the voice continued, you chose the trials instead of simply confessing your error. Why? I didn't have a choice, he shouted. If I backed out, it would have offended the Xaelithians. Earth couldn't afford that risk. The scene shifted again. This time, he was standing on a barren, rocky plain beneath an alien sky. The queen appeared before him, her form flickering like a hologram. Is that truly the reason, human? She asked, her voice calm but piercing. Or was it fear that drove your decision? Fear of failure? Fear of being remembered as the fool who ruined Earth's first contact. Elliot opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His chest tightened as the weight of her question settled over him. He hadn't even considered the possibility that his decision might have been motivated by selfishness, by a desperate need to prove himself, to avoid becoming the punchline of a cosmic joke. The veil's tendrils tightened around him, and the queen's image dissolved into countless fragments. For a moment, Elliot was suspended in a void, surrounded by nothing but his own thoughts. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though every flaw, every insecurity, was laid bare. But then, something shifted. The suffocating weight began to lift, replaced by a flicker of clarity. Yes, he was afraid of failure, of humiliation, of making the wrong choice. But beneath that fear was something else. A spark of determination. He hadn't chosen the trials because he was running away. He'd chosen them because, for the first time in his life, he wanted to take responsibility. He wanted to do the right thing, even if it scared him. "I didn't mean to propose," he said aloud, his voice steady now. "But I'm here because I want to fix what I broke. Not for myself, but for everyone involved. I can't promise I'll succeed, but I'll try." The void around him began to glow, the light growing brighter and warmer. The tendrils of the veil released him, and the swirling mass of light and shadow reformed into a humanoid shape. It bowed its head slightly, as though acknowledging his words, before dissolving into a cascade of shimmering particles. Elliot blinked as the arena came back into focus. The crowd was silent, their glowing eyes trained on him. Queen Seraveth stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You have passed the trial of truth," she said, her voice softer than before. "You have shown courage, wisdom, and sincerity. The bond you inadvertently formed has been nullified." Relief washed over Elliot, but it was short-lived. The Queen's next words sent a jolt through him. "However," she continued, "your actions have also demonstrated qualities that Xaelithians hold in the highest regard. Qualities befitting a consort." Elliot's jaw dropped. "Wait, what? I thought the bond was nullified." "It is," she said, a faint smile playing at her lips. "But the choice now rests with you, human. Will you leave Xaelith, free of obligation, or will you stay and explore the path fate has set before you?" Elliot stared at her, his mind racing. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation, waiting for his answer. For once in his life, Elliot Maxwell had no idea what to do. Elliot froze, his mind a whirlpool of disbelief, confusion, and a tinge of something he couldn't quite place. The entire Xaelithian court was silent, their glowing gazes locked on him. Queen Seraveth stood tall, her shimmering violet eyes calm and unwavering as they bore into his own. The way she phrased it, "the path fate has set before you," made his heart thrum with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. "This is a joke, right?" he said, almost to himself. "I passed the trials. You said I'm free." "You are," the Queen replied serenely. "But freedom does not negate opportunity." Her faint smile deepened, the kind of smile that hinted she was enjoying his reaction just a little too much. "The bond may be broken, but that does not mean the offer is withdrawn." Elliot blinked at her, struggling to find his voice. "You're asking me to stay? To willingly agree to this consort thing?" Her expression didn't change. "I am offering you the chance to forge a partnership, not out of accident or obligation, but out of choice. It is rare for a Xaelithian ruler to find a companion who demonstrates the qualities you have displayed. Rarer still for such a companion to come from beyond our stars." The crowd murmured softly, the sound like a breeze rippling through a dense forest. Elliot felt like every fiber of his being was being scrutinized, not just by the Queen, but by an entire planet of people. The weight of it was almost crushing. I don't think I'm the right person for this," he stammered, running a hand through his hair. "I'm just a technician. I don't know the first thing about ruling or intergalactic diplomacy," or he stopped himself before he could spiral further. "I'm nobody." Queen Seraveth tilted her head slightly, her glowing skin casting faint patterns on the ground as she stepped closer. "Nobody," she echoed, her voice softer now. "You ventured into the caverns of resilience and faced creatures that would have paralyzed most in fear. You resolved a conflict simulation that stumped even our most skilled strategists. And when your soul was laid bare before the veil, you showed a depth of integrity that even some of my own advisors lack. Tell me, Elliot Maxwell of Earth, does that sound like nobody to you?" Elliot opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Her words hit him harder than he expected. A part of him wanted to deny it all, to insist that he'd just been lucky, that he wasn't special. But another part of him, the part that had fought tooth and nail through the trials, was beginning to wonder if she might be right. "Let me make this clear," she said, her tone growing more formal again. "I do not ask this lightly. Nor do I expect an answer born of pressure. If you choose to leave, no harm will come to you or your people. You will be welcomed back to Xaelith as an honored guest should you ever return. But if you choose to stay, it will be as an equal. A partner, not a subordinate. The decision is yours." The crowd leaned forward as one, their glowing forms shimmering faintly in the light of Xaelith's twin suns. Even the queen seemed to hold her breath, waiting. Elliot swallowed hard. What am I supposed to say? He had never been particularly decisive. Back on Earth, he'd spent years avoiding major decisions, content to drift along in a life that felt safe but unremarkable. And yet here he was, standing at the crossroads of a choice that could alter not just his own life, but the trajectory of two worlds. The thing was, a tiny part of him wanted to say yes. He glanced around the arena, at the Xaelithians watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to cautious hope. He thought of the trials he'd endured, of the lessons he'd learned, not just about the Xaelithians, but about himself. For the first time in years, he'd felt like he was doing something that mattered. Like he wasn't just drifting anymore. But the risks. Oh, the risks. If he said yes, there was no turning back. He'd be leaving Earth, leaving behind everything he'd ever known. Could he really do that? Could he really step into the unknown like this? Finally, he looked back at Queen Seraveth. Her gaze was steady, patient, and for the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability there, as though she were as uncertain of his answer as he was. His voice caught, and he had to clear his throat. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." The queen inclined her head slightly. "Few are ready when fate calls upon them. But readiness is not what I ask of you. I ask only for your willingness to try." Elliot's chest tightened. Her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Willingness to try. It wasn't a promise of success, or perfection, or even certainty. It was a leap of faith. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the entire arena could hear it. "If I do this, if I stay, I don't know what kind of partner I'd be. I'm not a leader. I'm not," he trailed off, shaking his head. "You are enough," she said simply. Those 3 words hit him like a tidal wave, and before he could overthink it, he heard himself say, "Okay." The crowd erupted into a chorus of cheers and applause, the sound reverberating through the arena. Elliot felt like the ground might give way beneath him. He'd done it. He'd said yes. What the hell had he just agreed to? Queen Seraveth's smile widened, and for the first time, it seemed genuinely warm. She extended her hand to him, her fingers shimmering faintly with the light of Xaelith's suns. "Then let us walk this path together, Elliot Maxwell." Hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand. Her touch was cool but steady, and as their fingers intertwined, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The cheers of the crowd grew louder, and the queen turned to address them, her voice rising above the noise. "Let it be known that today, a new chapter begins for Xaelith and Earth. Together, we shall forge a future brighter than the stars themselves." Elliot barely registered her words. He was too busy grappling with the reality of what he'd just done. He'd agreed to stay. To become the queen's consort. To leave behind everything he'd ever known and step into a role he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And yet, as he stood there, hand in hand with the queen, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the mistake he'd thought it was. Maybe this was the beginning of something extraordinary. The days following Elliot's decision passed in a blur. The Xaelithian court moved swiftly to integrate him into their culture, their customs, and, most overwhelming of all, their expectations. Overnight, he went from being an unremarkable technician from Earth to a figure of immense curiosity and scrutiny. Everywhere he went, Xaelithians whispered behind glowing hands, their swirling eyes tracking his every move. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him with each passing moment. Queen Seraveth, to her credit, was patient with him. She seemed to sense his unease and went out of her way to ease him into his new role. On his second day in the palace, a sprawling structure carved from shimmering crystal and set high atop a cliff, She summoned him to a private terrace overlooking the Xaelithian capital. The view was breathtaking, with the twin suns casting golden light over the city's bioluminescent streets, which glowed faintly even in daylight. "Elliot," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, "you must be honest with me. Are you afraid?" He hesitated, leaning against the crystal railing as he searched for the right words. "Terrified," he admitted finally. "I have no idea what I'm doing here. I don't know your culture, your people, your expectations. What if I screw this up?" Seraveth tilted her head, her violet eyes studying him carefully. "You are not expected to know everything," she said. "That is why I am here. To guide you, to teach you, and perhaps to learn from you as well." "Learn from me?" Elliot laughed nervously. "What could I possibly teach you? You're a queen. I'm just a guy who fixes broken machines." She smiled faintly. "Humility, for one. Perspective, for another. The Xaelithian court has long been insular, isolated from the wider universe. Your presence is a reminder that there is more beyond our borders. More to understand. More to embrace." Elliot wasn't sure what to say to that, so he simply nodded. The queen turned her gaze back to the city below, her expression thoughtful. "There is one thing you must understand about Xaelithian culture," she said after a long pause. "Our people revere balance. Every partnership, every bond, must be built on mutual respect and harmony. If you are willing to walk this path with me, then we will walk it together, as equals." Elliot looked at her, startled by the sincerity in her tone. He hadn't expected that. Back on Earth, power dynamics were rarely so balanced. But here she was, an alien queen, offering him not subservience, but partnership. "I'll do my best," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. She smiled again, and this time, there was no trace of formality in it. "That is all I ask." The following weeks were a whirlwind of lessons and ceremonies. Elliot was assigned a Xaelithian mentor, a stoic advisor named Caervos, whose patience seemed almost infinite. Caervos drilled him on everything from Xaelithian etiquette to their complex system of governance, which revolved around consensus building rather than authoritarian rule. Elliot struggled to keep up, but Caervos never once raised his voice or expressed frustration. "The queen chose you for a reason," he said one evening as they walked through the palace gardens, where bioluminescent flowers glowed softly in the twilight. "Do not doubt her judgment. If she believes you are capable, then you are." "I wish I had her confidence," Elliot muttered. "You will in time," Caervos said. "Confidence is not born of certainty. It is born of effort." The first major test of his new role came sooner than he expected. A delegation of Xaelithian nobles, powerful figures who controlled the planet's various regions, arrived at the palace to formally acknowledge Elliot's position as the queen's consort. Or, as he quickly realized, to test his worthiness. The nobles were intimidating, their bioluminescent skin glowing brighter than most Xaelithians, a sign of their elevated status. They asked probing questions about his intentions, his background, and his ability to contribute to Xaelithian society. One particularly sharp-tongued noble, Lady Nyxora, seemed determined to undermine him at every turn. "How does a human, a species with no psionic abilities, no connection to the eternal weave, expect to rule alongside our queen?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Elliot felt the familiar flush of anxiety rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't have psionic abilities, no," he admitted. "But I do have something else. Perspective. I come from a planet that's had to solve problems without the advantages you have here. I've learned how to think creatively, how to adapt. And I think those skills can be valuable here, too." Nyxora raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Creative thinking cannot substitute for a lack of connection to the weave. Elliot hesitated, unsure how to respond, but Queen Seraveth stepped in. "Lady Nyxora," she said, her tone cool but firm, "you speak as though the weave is the only source of strength. Yet you forget that strength takes many forms. Elliot has demonstrated courage, ingenuity, and integrity, qualities that cannot be measured by psionic power alone." Nyxora bowed her head, though her expression remained skeptical. "Of course, Your Majesty." After the meeting, Elliot slumped into a chair in the Queen's private chamber, exhausted. "That was brutal," he said, rubbing his temples. "Does everyone here hate me?" "They do not hate you," Seraveth said, pouring a shimmering liquid into 2 crystal glasses. "They fear change. You are an anomaly, Elliot. An outsider. It is natural for them to question your place here." "Natural doesn't make it easier," he muttered. "No," she agreed, handing him one of the glasses. "But if you can win their respect, it will be all the more meaningful." He sipped the drink, which tasted like a mix of citrus and honey, and gave her a small smile. "Thanks for backing me up in there." She inclined her head. "We are partners, are we not?" Her words sent a strange warmth through his chest. For the first time since his arrival on Xaelith, he felt a flicker of confidence. Maybe he really could do this. As weeks turned into months, Elliot began to settle into his new role. He spent hours studying Xaelithian history, learning about their complex traditions and values. He worked alongside Seraveth to address issues brought to the court, offering his own perspective on matters ranging from resource management to interplanetary relations. Slowly but surely, he began to earn the respect of those who had doubted him. But it wasn't all politics and diplomacy. Seraveth insisted that he take time to explore Xaelith itself, to truly understand the world he had chosen to call home. Together, they visited sprawling bioluminescent forests, ancient ruins carved into mountains, and bustling markets filled with alien wares. During these moments, Elliot began to see a different side of her, a side that was curious, playful, and deeply connected to her people. One evening, as they stood on a cliff overlooking a vast, glowing ocean, Elliot turned to her. "Why did you really give me a choice?" he asked. "You could have just made me stay." She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Because choice is the foundation of trust," she said. "And trust is the foundation of any true bond." Elliot nodded, her words settling deep in his chest. He still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as the twin suns dipped below the horizon, casting Xaelith in a soft golden glow, he couldn't help but think that this strange, beautiful world, and its equally strange, beautiful queen, had become more than just his home. It had become his purpose.